Great. Okay. So as well as the chat box, as I said, there'll be plenty of time for discussion and questions and answers. But we'd also invite you to keep this conversation going on social media platforms. So you can tag us. On Facebook, you'll find us as Development Perspectives, and on Instagram and Twitter as Dev Perspectives. So we'd love to see exactly what's going on out there once this conversation is over. I'd like to introduce you to our guests this evening. So I'm just going to share my screen just so you can have an idea of our evening ahead. So let me just share that. So we're delighted, really honoured that Ciara is with us this evening. Ciara Hyland is a writer, director and producer of documentaries, both historical and contemporary. Her recent documentary, Cogadh Mhná, War on Women, was aired on both RTE and TG Cahir. And it's a phenomenal, very, very powerful piece. So I look forward to being able to discuss, and I'm sure you do too, having some conversation piece with her. We're also going to hear from Sean Cooke. He's the CEO of Men's Development Network. He will be joining us later, and they launched their White Ribbon campaign. So it's it's what men can do to end violence against women and promote gender equality. And as I mentioned, today is the UN International Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women, and the launch of the Orange the World, hashtag Orange the World campaign, which is a call to 16 days of activism, which is lovely because it brings us up to the 10th of December. And the 10th of December is the International Day of Human Rights. And we know that women's rights and gender equality is human rights. So I'm just going to stop sharing there for one moment and coming back in. And as I said, you know, our key piece here, we're really, really delighted to be able to speak with Ciara. And I'm sure you've many, many questions. But just to get this conversation piece started, Ciara, you're very, very welcome. Hold on, I'm just going to ask you to unmute yourself there, and we can. How are you, Ciara? Lovely to see. Yeah, we can hear you all good. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. Ciara, your recent documentary, Cogadh Mhná, a really, really powerful piece. And, you know, when we look, gender-based violence and sexual assaults against women are a harrowing reality of war, both historically and currently across the world. However, in Ireland, up until now, there's been a belief that this is not the case during the Irish Revolution. It's been a real taboo subject, and, you know, certainly not part of historical accounts, which tend to focus on more of the political and military aspects. And, you know, can you share with us how you came across these women's stories and why you felt it's so important? So just a bit of a background, please, we'd love to hear about the documentary.
Hi, Karen. Thanks very much for having me here. I'm delighted to be here this evening. I suppose the background to how Cogadh Mhná got made was, like you say, you know, most of the history of the revolution has focused very much, I suppose, on the men. It's focused very much on the political side, on the military side, on who fought and all that. And I suppose with the whole decade of centenaries happening, you know, there was, I suppose, a broadening out of that narrative to include more civilians and non-combatants, and we started to look at women in terms of like Mhná and you know, their sort of political role and their military role, but very little work was actually done in the public realm about you know, the majority of women who were civilians, what was their experience of the war? I mean, as somebody said, half the population was female. They didn't all leave the country during the conflict. So what was it like for these women? And I suppose that's been kind of churning away around in the sort of ether around the whole decade of centenaries for quite a while. But there's been a whole host of historians, mostly female historians, and sociologists, and also, I suppose, gender historians that would look specifically at gender, and they all started to research the notion of sexual violence during the Irish Revolution, because for many years it was seen as like not having happened. And in fact, there's a whole body of work that has kind of twisted itself into knots trying to explain the reasons why it didn't happen and giving all these reasons, that our men were too well behaved, the Brits were too afraid of the bad propaganda, we were a very Catholic country, we'd respect for women. It was like all these notions and all these ideas. And it's only recently that actually stories, first-hand accounts of women that had actually happened to during the War of Independence and the Civil War, it's only recently that those accounts have actually started to come to light and people have started to bring them out into the public. And it's been quite eye-opening, and it's been quite jaw-dropping for a lot of people. I suppose for myself, I first came across it when a friend of mine who's a journalist wrote an article, and he in it basically highlighted the work of these kind of female academics who were bringing this material to the forefront. And it was actually just a jaw-dropping experience for me. I was like, oh, why have I never heard of this before? Oh, why has this not been done? Why do we not know about this? Why is this not more wider known? So basically the documentary grew out of that.
Yeah, it is incredible to think that 100 years later that we are only, really bringing it out into the public domain. And I remember, I think it'd be lovely for you to share just, with regards to the actual getting it to over the line and actually creating the documentary. Would you mind sharing that story?
No, I don't mind at all. Okay, so I read Niall Murray, he's a journalist. I read his article and I suppose it lit a fire in me, and I went, I really want to make this one. I totally want to make this one. But I suppose, documentaries, there's only a certain amount of funding to go around. The broadcasters are limited in what they can make for funding reasons and for, all kinds of reasons. And so you have to go to the broadcasters and you have to make a case for why this needs to be made. So I had put it in just as a couple of lines of an idea. And then I went off to New York to shoot. I did one on Valera as well for my sins. So I was actually in New York doing a documentary on Valera, and I got really sick. I got off the plane and within 2 days I was in bed with the flu and couldn't move. Like, it was just horrendous. And obviously, you've only got this certain amount of time in New York. You have to try and keep working. You have to shoot. You have to get the material if you can. So I was really sick and still trying to work as best I could. And my producer called me from Ireland and he went, the broadcasters love the idea, but they want a 1-page outline from you for tomorrow. And I was like, what? There's no way I'm going to get that written up in time. And he was like, well, Ciara, if you want to make it, this is what you have to do. So I sat in bed in New York dying with the flu, and I wrote a really impassioned, I think it's probably the most angriest, most passionate thing I've ever written in my life. It just poured out of me onto the page about why this absolutely should be made and why these stories should be told, and how it was just not okay that they'd been silenced for 100 years and that people still believed this was not a part of the Irish Revolution. So yeah, I look back at it and I'm going, I don't know how I wrote it, but I did, and I'm glad I did, because if I hadn't written it, it wouldn't have gotten made. So
yeah, well, we're all very, very appreciative, and I know the women who've gone before us are appreciative too. So, who knows? It was all meant to be, even if you were going through the flu. So thank you so much.
Broadcasters too, by the way. Sorry, I just have to say that thanks to, it was backed by TG Carr and by RTE,
yeah,
and also by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, which comes out of the license fee. So, all of those backed it, and if they hadn't backed it, it wouldn't have gotten made. So I just want to say very grateful to them too.
Excellent. So in the documentary, it's wonderful because you use both historians and scholars, and as I said, sociologists, to discuss the evidence. But also, one of the most significant aspects of it is the use of storytelling. And storytelling is such a big part of development education, to recount the women's experience. Can you tell us about this process and why it was the direction that you felt was important to take?
Yeah. I suppose I know you feel this too, because we've had conversations about it, but like storytelling for me is just so important, because I think storytelling humanizes things that are perhaps too big otherwise for us to take in properly as individuals. I think you can talk about atrocities in terms of numbers, but sometimes the scale of that is just too big for our brains to maybe really grasp the reality of it. But if you start to tell individual stories, suddenly it becomes real, and suddenly you're talking about real human beings that you can relate to. And so I think storytelling is really, really important for that. And I think, like all art, I think the purpose of art really is to make us understand what it's like to be somebody else. I think, isn't that the whole point of literature and films and books and songs? It's to make us see the world from what it's like to walk in somebody else's shoes. And I think that's why art is civilizing. I think that's why it makes us human. And so I very much wanted to do that with this documentary. I thought these women wrote their stories in their own words in a whole host of ways. They wrote letters, they wrote diaries, they gave witness testimonies. There were some court cases, diaries. And I thought, you know what, these women, they weren't heard by their society at the time. They were silenced at the time. And I thought, now it's time to hear their words, and it's time to tell their stories in their own words. And I think that gave it just a power to the storytelling that I think it wouldn't have had otherwise. And very much from day one, we kind of decided that was how we wanted to do it, for all those reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really does come across. And I think exactly it's telling their words and telling their stories and coming from their perspective. And one thing that I found so profound was in the use of how you filmed it, was centering the woman, not just her story, but centering the woman. So it was, it really allowed that story to be told. And I think it's so important, isn't it, to see the humanity in others, not just always center ourselves. It was an incredible process.
Yeah.
And so, with regards to the actual making of oh, you okay? Did I lose you there?
Am I freezing on you? I think you're freezing on me. Sorry.
It's
my reception.
Perhaps it's
kind of crap. Can you see me?
Yeah, we can indeed. It's probably a pause in the significant moments for all of us to take these points in. A chance to reflect and let it sink in. And then just, because I'm going to open up the floor, because I'm sure people have questions that they want to ask and discuss. And but just one of the other significant points that I wanted to point out was around the reality about the formation of the Irish Free State, with this very dark secret about women woven into its fabric. And so it feels that this documentary really is significant today as it was back then. So what are your thoughts about that? Because it really was quite a profound piece.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on that one. Like, it is woven into the very founding of the Irish Free State, very much so. Part of the silencing is because once the Free State is founded, a new identity for Ireland has to be created. What is the identity of this new country that's literally just finding its feet? And part of that identity is that it's very Catholic, to distinguish itself from Protestant England, for example. It kind of, the identity is that we're very Catholic, we're very pure, our men are heroic, and our women are pure. And we have this model society where everybody knows their place, that men belong in the public sphere and women's realm is very much the home. Now, there were lots of women at the time who totally objected to that, and they fought a losing battle. But it is very much woven into the identity of the new Free State. And it's not just the silencing of sexual abuse, and it's not just the relegation of women back into the home and out of the public sphere. It's also things like the first mother and baby homes were founded by the new Irish Free State. They are the inheritance of the workhouse system that the Brits had. But at the same time, the very first mother and baby homes, they're 1921-22. and they're very much also part of that whole thing. And I mean, look at the mess that we have now and the legacy of that we're still dealing with. So there is an awful lot, yeah, that of how our society was set up that does go right back to the weaving into the birth of the Free State. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your question? Sorry.
No.
I feel like I answered half of it.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's so much that we could converse with, but I'd really like to welcome other people's voices into this conversation. So if somebody feels more comfortable putting a question into the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, and again, just invite everybody to remember that this is a really safe space for everybody. So in a respectful, let's all converse in a respectful and mindful way, engage together. So if you want to, feel free, you can unmute yourself, and if you want to ask a question, or if you'd like to pop it into the chat box, we'd love to hear from you.
I have a question.
Great.
It's not a question, it's more, how are you doing? I'm Nicola. It's more, I suppose the formation of the Irish Free State was just a generation or two ago, two in some cases, but for me, it was probably my grandfather's time. So yeah, 2 generations ago. And that's ingrained in us, that's in our DNA. It's in our bloodline, and not that far back either. So if we look at science and they say we carry the DNA and the ancestral lineage back 7 generations, this is very current. And you know, when I watched the documentary, it was all violence in the home. So the military came into the homes of these women and performed whatever violence, and yet history replays itself. So we're still replaying the same history, violence in the home. And we saw it especially spike over COVID. We saw it spike over COVID. It was there beforehand. It was there for my mother's generation, my grandmother's generation, and it's all home-based violence. And I think the war is always on women, no matter what is happening. You know, economic issues, that war is on women. The Carlow school yesterday, you know, the girls being told not to wear tight gym pants because of the male teachers. Now, if I was a male teacher in that school, I'd have an objection as well. But the war is always on women. In every realm, and we are just repeating history even now. So we know we are repeating history. How do we look to our next generations and say, we knew we were doing it, but we left it continue? So you know, how do we break it? I expect you to have all the magic answers.
No pressure, Ciara.
But I don't have the answers. I mean, I don't have the answers for that, because it's a huge thing. But I think it's really important to talk about stuff. I think the silencing of stuff allows it to continue. And I think at least when you break the silence and you start to say stuff out loud and have conversations like this, I think that really helps. And I think it also helps us to say it's not acceptable. I think to have that become a common thing where it's just not acceptable anymore. But also we get to talk about what kind of society we want, you know, we get to reimagine our society by talking about it and having conversations. And I think this is why everybody should study history, because, you know, we repeat our history until we learn to do it differently. So, you know, I other than that, I don't know. I'm sure other people who are maybe more subject experts in that area might actually have better answers. But for me, coming from a documentary perspective, it's breaking the silence and having the conversations that we need to have.
And you did that. I mean, you told the women's stories beautifully. Yeah, I'm sure everybody else here was absolutely outraged. I'm outraged that I didn't see it either, because, you know, looking back on the documents and looking back on the accounts, it's there in plain sight when you look for it.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Yeah, everybody goes, of course it happened.
Yeah.
But you need it pointed out first. Yeah, I was like that too.
And there it is in plain sight. So thank you for your work. I think it's amazing. It's amazing.
Thanks.
You've nudged us forward a bit.
Thanks. But it was really the historians who brought it to light first. Do you know what I mean? I just
Yeah.
gave a public platform to it, but it's
Yeah.
their work. Yeah. So thanks.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Really profound points there. Thank you, Nicola. Is there anybody else you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, join the discussion?
Hi there. I have a question.
Hi, how are you?
Hi. Hi, Anna.
I think it's going to be another one of those kind of almost existential kind of questions, and I don't expect an answer by any means. But something that I have found over the last couple of years, even like attending anything, be it about women's mental health, violence against women, sexual violence, economic kind of oppression of women, anything involving women's rights in where we are oppressed by our oppressor is men. It is the male class. As much as I have men in my life that I adore and love, unfortunately they are, you know, in essence a part of a class that oppresses women. And I'm just wondering, I can already hear the cries and objections from my male friends who are like, you know, militant Republicans about this issue. And I'm just wondering, how on earth do we include more men in these conversations, or not necessarily get men on board, because that sounds a little bit condescending or something, but I don't know, get them to give a shit about these issues, because preaching to a bunch of you know, feminist women, which is often what these audiences are made up of, doesn't really get us anywhere. It gives women a space to speak and, you know, a space to voice our opinions and everything. I'm just wondering how I never see men in these, and I'm delighted to hear that the Men's Network is going to be speaking on it, because I think that's really who needs to speak to these issues and you know, get men on board, because it's kind of preaching to the choir sometimes, these issues. And I'm just wondering if there's, Ciara, if there's anything you came across in the document. I actually hadn't heard about the documentary, but that's an absolutely fascinating topic. So I'm really looking forward to watching it. I already have it up on RT Player here to watch when we're finished. But I'm just wondering, how do we get men on board with these issues? And I think especially this will strike a chord with a lot of men who would hold very dear the heroes of the Irish Civil War revolution in Ireland. Yeah, how do we get men on board, basically? Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. I'm going to have a go at answering that, but then I'm going to ask if anybody else has also got suggestions, because I don't think I have all the answers for this one. Can you guys hear me, by the way?
Yes.
You can hear me, perfect. Okay. I lost a good friend actually over this doc. I lost a guy I had been friends with since I was 20. I'd actually known him since college, and when he heard I was making the documentary, I asked him to be in it actually, and he basically told me that I was pissing on our glorious revolution. That's a quote. And we had a huge argument, and that friendship is no longer there, which is a huge pity. He wasn't the only one. I did get complaints. There were one or two complaints to the broadcasters about how the Republicans had done it, how they were willing to accept that the Free State had done it, but not the Republicans. I mean, it was just, but you know, that's just the nature of it, really. You're always going to get people who disagree. You can't keep everybody happy all the time, right? You just have to be, I suppose, true to what it is you feel is important to say. In terms of bringing men on board, like, we need male allies. Like, I mean, violence against women isn't something that women can solve themselves on their own. Like, it has to be across society, and men are 50% of society. So I think it's incredibly important. I think I have a lot of hope for the generation coming up, actually, because I think there's a really nice, I don't know, I think they're just a very nice generation coming up, the younger generation. Like, I think they're quite open. I think they're very liberal. I think they're their views on gender are so much more fluid than, you know, maybe my generations or the older generations even. So I'm hoping that will help. How do you talk to somebody who doesn't want to hear? I don't know how you do that, really. I think it's incredibly important that we do have men as allies, and I think if we can find ways to bring them in as allies. And I think the Me Too movement in a lot of ways was really good, because it made people go, this is a really common experience for a lot of women. Like, this is what it's like for a lot of women. So I think if more men could maybe understand that that's the lived experience for women, I think that helps. I think it's back to that thing of trying to understand what it's like for another human being. You know, what is it like to be that person and to have their experiences? And I think if we can get men to understand that, maybe that brings them on board more. But I don't know, maybe other people, I'd love to open that up actually out to anybody else who's got something to say or suggestions.
Nick?
Maybe, I'm
Oh, hi.
Hi. How's it going? Yeah, I'll be the male representative. I think that you're right. I think that men aren't on board with a lot of issues that are particularly important and pertinent to women. And I don't know if anybody heard an interview that Sarah McInerney did on the radio there. I think it was about maybe a week ago. And she had two, I think they were Cork County councillors on that she was talking to, who wanted to put up plethora statues down a street in Cork, and they were all men. And these two men, they sounded, I don't know what ages they were, but I presume they were older, possibly over 30, over 40, and they literally could not see her point of view at all. And you could hear she was getting quite frustrated, and rightly so too. And I think that the language that they had, the language that they've grown up with and that they've been surrounded by, and the education that they've had, I think that has kind of what has entrenched their views and their outlook on life. And I think that it's a bit of a long look on things, but I don't think things for men are going to change all that quickly. I think it's an educational thing and a pedagogical thing. And I think that like when younger people are brought up in an environment that highlights the importance of women's issues, because it wasn't something that even when I was in school at a young age, sure, like women's issues, they weren't a thing at all. Like, I mean, it was just something that there was a particular way of being educated, and that was it. And luckily, I was brought up by a single mother, and she taught me different in the house, I suppose. But so anyway, I suppose my point is that I think that it will probably be slow, but it'll be an educational thing, and it'll be from kind of a young age. And as you mentioned as well, it'll be the next generation or generations of people who will come up, and they'll have more awareness of it, I suppose.
And I think just to jump in on that is that we are lucky that unfortunately Sean should be joining us shortly, but you know that they come. It is an organisation specifically. It's Men's Development Network, and it's about making their lives better for men. And we get to speak to him and get that perspective going, so that they are working. It is happening out there. But you're right, Anna. It's like, where do we begin? And I think they're all very valid points. The conversations have to be had, and it's keep sharing it and keep including it. Some will be more difficult than others. Martine, I see. Did you want to make a point there? And I've got a couple of chat box.
I did, because I suppose I am here with many hats on. I suppose as a woman and as a mother of sons, and I'm not as hopeful as you are for the present young generation, Ciara, I suppose, in terms of the amount of abuse that happens online, on social media, all of that sort of stuff. So my other hats are, I work with MOVE, which is a male perpetrator program. I'm a facilitator there. So I think somebody else said earlier, sometimes when we're singing to the choir, men have to change. The only way we're going to actually end violence is for the change to happen with the male population. So we work with perpetrators, and they're very often referred through the courts, through social work, all that sort of stuff. So you're getting, when people are coming to us, they're coming at a stage where behavior is really ingrained. So there's a lot of work to bring awareness and to help people change. And it's facilitated by a male and a female. So it's having really good men, really good role model men as facilitators in it. That's the most powerful thing. Because sometimes, with women working with guys, they'll take a certain amount, but they do need to see that men can be different. Some of them have had horrendous histories themselves. So my other hat is that I have very recently been a founder of a charity called Same Cambodia. So we have a very young worker, well, she's almost 30 now, but she was working as a teacher in Cambodia and realized the incredible gender violence that exists in Cambodia and inequality. And she was noticing it among 12 to 17-year-olds. So what we've done is we have set up a charity called Same Cambodia. We've developed a gender equality and human rights program that's going to be delivered to schools on a modular basis, because in Cambodia, in Ireland, I was trying to think of something for an article that we're pulling together. In Ireland, we still have a shockingly high level of domestic violence, and we saw that within COVID, how much worse it got. But imagine living in a country where we don't even have any structures to deal with anything, where there's no, where it's not recognized, where I think 67% of women believe that it's okay to stay in a relationship to save the family. They have gender rules books that tell them how boys should live, how girls should live. Sexual violence is a pastime. There's gang rape as a weekend event, but I suppose I'm going a very long-winded way to saying that developing a program that starts with 12-year-old boys and girls and gets them together talking about gender, talking about human rights, talking about what's okay, what's not okay, and getting them to experience each other differently, so that that girls aren't objectified, and in that way it's more easy to be violent towards them if they're objectified. And it's also in Cambodia a huge cultural change for girls as well, because they have grown up in a society, and I suppose like Ireland and like we're talking about the Civil War and the War of Independence and all of that. I suppose it's the hangover from the violence of that time in Ireland, and also the hangover from the violence in Cambodia, that I suppose levels of violence are so high. I'm not sure of the full connection of that, but I definitely think there has to be a huge connection in that area.
Martina, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for your work. Just one of your points there leads in nicely, actually. In the chat box, Georgia asked the question. She said she knows it's a broad question, but we learned about the Irish Revolution at school at 10. So you were talking about children over in programs in Cambodia, and didn't learn about the abuse of women during this time until 6th year Leaving Cert history. It wasn't on the curriculum, but it was a younger teacher who educated them. This leads me to think about when it's appropriate to teach children and teens about these things. And is there a difference in being taught about violence in war or violence versus violence against women? And how do you think we broach this topic with a younger audience? And when do you think it should be in the Leaving Cert curriculum? And one of the things actually I think as well is, I know somebody was just asking me about, how do we engage the public on sexual violence through storytelling? So, Ciara, not to throw just so much, again, we're not expecting the answers, but just perhaps your opinion sharing, with regards to when you're going to make, I suppose, because the nature of making a documentary, it's about how do you choose, what and how you're going to broach it?
Okay, that's a huge in relation to the what age, that's outside of my expertise. I don't know. I'm not a teacher, you know what I mean? So I hope somebody else here can maybe talk about that and answer that part of the question. I find it really interesting that person actually had a teacher that brought that subject up with them in 6th class. I mean, or 6th year. That's pretty amazing, actually, because it's very rare for that to even be taught in schools, that part of the Irish Revolution. So in terms of, do you want to open that part up to the floor, or will I change the topic and talk about how we deal with subjects in documentary making? Or they're kind of almost like two separate topics?
I know. Well, I'll tell you what, is there anyone that has a specific point about teaching of children in schools? I think maybe what we'll do is, Ciara, if we could just hear from, if you want to continue on that point, and then we can open up both to the floor, if that's okay.
Yeah.
If everyone's okay with that.
Yeah, I suppose I can talk specifically about this particular documentary, and I can just talk about how I did it, but that doesn't mean it's the only way to do it or that there aren't other approaches that are equally valid. I suppose I always knew that I wanted the women's words and the women's stories to be really central to it. I knew that I wanted that, and I knew that I didn't want to concentrate on perpetrators, and I knew that I didn't want to. I kind of felt it wasn't about them. I kind of felt it was about the women's experience. And so I wanted the stories to reflect the emotional reality of what it was like for these women. And I suppose being a female filmmaker, we do sometimes come at things slightly differently. And I think we do make stuff that focuses on slightly different things. And I think if I had been a male filmmaker, I probably wouldn't have focused as much and put the women as central or on the emotional impact of it, because a lot of these women didn't get any legal justice, or they didn't really get any recognition at the time. And so, I thought at least I could give them that the emotions that come through in their writing and the experiences of it. And I think that for me is what the central heart of the documentary was. And it seems to be what people related to most, was the centering of these women's experiences as much as we could. Now, obviously it's 100 years later, and so you're extrapolating and fictionalizing to a certain extent about what it was like for them, but you at the same time you're doing your best to be as faithful to what they wrote as you can be. And I think that's, for me, the power of telling stories and the power of making people understand what somebody else's experience is like. And I think to my dying day as a documentary maker, I'll probably defend that that it's all about that. It's always about trying to make somebody else understand what it is like to be somebody else. And I think it's just so important on so many levels. It's the basis of empathy, maybe, and the basis of understanding, and possibly the basis of change. So that's just my own for what it's worth.
No, absolutely. And you put it so eloquently, and it's bringing it back to the humanity and telling that story from their perspective. I see in the chat box as well, Tom commented, in addition, it's channeled through new generational educators. So I think that goes back to the point of how do we bring up that subject and how do we make the changes. Yes, I think it's probably as well relating back to the conversation piece where we had that Anna mentioned about how do we bring that conversation and get men on board. So does anybody else have anything in particular that they wanted to ask Ciara about the documentary, anything about the subject of gender equality or this campaign of ending violence against women?
Can I ask a fun question? This might be a fun question, but you did the Valera documentary, and then and while you were doing that, the documentary, this documentary came up as an opportunity. How did all that feel together?
Sorry, would you repeat that, please? Sorry.
How did all of that feel when it all I suppose, came together in New York and you were feeling so crappy?
Yeah, it's always a bit mental, but like, oh geez, yeah, I mean that's normal for me, really. Like, my brain is normally a big smash up of like lots of different ideas simultaneously. So like I finished Cogadh, and I went straight into one on hunger strikes. So it's like, yeah. And I'm now doing one on musicians. So it's always, but that's the beauty of making documentaries, is that you get to live in lots of different worlds for a while. So
yeah, that's good.
Thanks. That was a fun question.
Does anybody
do I have time to ask
yes,
one more question?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Absolutely.
I was just wondering, one of the letters at the start of the documentary, there was a point made about the language of it, and it kind of obscured maybe some of the violence that was behind it. Do you think that that a lot of the language, because it was, I suppose, of a different time, did obscure quite a lot of what was going on, and maybe even, I mean, even though maybe they didn't think there was an audience to their letters, that it was going to be, they were hiding it from themselves, I suppose, by the way they were speaking about it, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. A lot of the phrases that were used in the letters and the diaries, they're euphemisms. They're like There are ways of alluding to what happened to these women without saying straight out they were raped or sexually assaulted. And a lot of historians missed them, you know, the very first time they went over this material, because they were looking for specific words. And if they didn't find the specific word, they just assumed that sexual violence wasn't part of the story. And it took really people going back over some of that material and rereading it and putting it into context and understanding, like the word outrage is used quite a bit, like he outraged me, you know, and suddenly people realized actually that's an allusion probably to a possible rape. And so you have to go back and you have to relook at it. But if you were to just add up the incidences where the words rape or sexual assault are used, or you were to add up like court cases where people were convicted, you would totally have the conviction that it was an incredibly exceptional war, in that sexual violence wasn't a part of it. It's only when you dig into the language. And so you sometimes have to, it's a lesson really in understanding things in the terms of the people who are trying to tell you what happened to them in their stories, to understand it in their terms and in their language, and not really impose your own interpretation on it, if you know what I mean. So yeah, the use of language is really, really fascinating around the whole thing. So yeah.
I think one that really stuck out for me was he satisfied his duty passion on me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Lindsay Erna Byrne, who found that letter, she found it in the Dublin Diocesan Archive. It was written to the Archbishop of Dublin, actually, who it was written by a woman who basically got pregnant as a result of a rape, and she wrote to the Archbishop looking for financial help to have her son adopted. And what's amazing about that is that the Archbishop gave her the money and didn't question it, and he had rigorously questioned many other petitioners who had also written to him looking for money for different things, you know, for poverty or for, you know, their kids or health or, you know, kind of whatever dire straits they found themselves in. There was always questions asked about it, you know, but there were no questions asked in this case. He just gave it. And so we didn't include it in the documentary, but it also raises the issue of why did he give it so automatically? Why didn't he question it? And then one of the possible conclusions of that is because he knew that this was happening. He knew that this was possibly widespread, and it wasn't an unusual situation for him. It didn't make him question the veracity of it, because maybe it was in the ether that these things were actually happening. So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It is phenomenal what was found, and certainly the language in which it was used. So what I'd just like to invite everyone to do, I'm just going to share my screen, if you could just bear with me for, okay, sorry. Now, and okay, can you all see this? Yeah, great. Yeah, great. So these are two of the infographics that the UN have made available. They're readily available, and I'll send you the link to them. And you know, I think it's a really powerful statement. The way in which violence against women is understood has significant implications for its responses to it. And that's both here nationally and internationally. And today I heard the head of the Students' Union in Ireland, Claire, she's a very articulate speaker, and she said that there was a real urgent need for a cultural shift in attitudes, mindset and behaviours. And what I'd like to do is like, I mean, if you look at those statements, it's like, don't get raped, and we really need to change that culture, as people have mentioned, to don't rape. So what I'd like to invite you all to do is I'm going to put you into a breakout room and just give you 10 minutes, and just within that breakout room, just to kind of discuss, you know, what you feel around those cultural shifts and attitudes, mindsets and behaviors, and then we can come back and share in the wider group. So if everybody's okay with that, I am going to just pause the recording. So we're just welcoming people back from breakout rooms. Check. Okay, so welcome back everybody. We hope you enjoyed that opportunity for discussion. So is there anybody who'd like to share any of the discussion piece or anything you'd like to comment on before we introduce our next guest, Sean from the Men's Development Network? Okay. I think they're all very eager to hear you speak, Sean. So we'd like to welcome Sean Cooke. He is the CEO of Men's Development Network. And today they launched their annual White Ribbon campaign. And as I said earlier at the opening, that the White Ribbon campaign is based around what men can do to end violence against women and promote gender equality. And I know from some of the comments that we had earlier on that it is certainly part of the, oh, hold on, yes. Nick, can you just check that last, sorry, I'll check it now, sorry.
Yeah, no, I can help out.
Great. So Sean, you're very welcome with us this evening. If you could, I think some people have, there you go. You're very welcome with us this evening, and we'd just love to hear a bit about your organisation and about your campaign which you launched today.
Good evening, everybody, and listen, thanks, Karen, for the invite today. I'm delighted to be here. The Men's Development Network has in existence for about 23 years, and it originally established itself as a father support organisation, a father support group, in terms of there were a group of men who were involved in community development work or in services, who recognised that they really like to support each other to become better fathers, better husbands, better partners in their lives. And they were conscious that some of the aspects of living as a man in Ireland and across the world, in terms of the expectations of what it is, in terms of around what masculinity is, was hindering them being their most authentic self. And so a lot of the work was very much around that time of supporting each other as a group. And it expanded its work then over the period to become the Southeast Men's Development Network, to then becoming a national network about 15 years ago. So that's just kind of its general, its origins. And from that, I suppose, from the work that it used to do in doing group work with men and support work with men, and quite a number of issues and programs emanated out of that. So we began to develop what we call our developmental program, is because we work with men developmentally. Okay, so we're coming at it from a perspective where we take men from where they're at. Okay, and if I was just to take something here in front of me, like, what we try to do is say like, we work with men for the premise that men are good, feeling, creative, and intelligent. And that what we really try to do is about establishing a position as a place of safety and support and engagement. So that's how we go about the work when we start to work. And we do that what we call our new conversations with men, and our 7 key questions pieces of work. Which the 7 key questions are very basic questions, but they're brilliant questions around engaging men at the start, about creating that safety, about creating that opportunity to discuss things, about taking responsibility for yourself and your feelings. And the 7 key questions have 3 elements attached to them. One is that it's reflective from the start. The other bit then is a bit of an analysis in terms of what you might need. And then the third bit is about taking action. So there are the 3, and there are 7 questions based in around that particular area. And from that methodology, we started doing a lot of work with other men. We were approached by organizations to do work with men who were out of work and they needed to get back into employment or whatever it may be. And so from that, we recognized that there was a considerable amount of blockages for men, not around entering back into work, but they weren't about work. They were very much around the social determinants that were impacting on their lives, or for me. So, and a lot of them were based around health as well, but not just the medical aspect of health, it was mental health and stuff like that. So we started doing a lot of work in that area, and we developed a lot of relationships and allies with people like Dr. Noel Richardson and Carlow IT, the Men's Health Centre, the HSE, and through its Health and Wellbeing Unit, and with the Men's Health Forum of Ireland. So we developed these relationships, and we developed a program of work with them. And Ireland, just to be clear, it was the first organisation in the world, first country in the world to get to have a men's health policy, and that it wasn't based upon a medical policy; it was based upon medical and a social determinants perspective. So we're looking about what was the impact, what was impacting on men's health, and we are part of the development of that policy, and we're very much part of the role in advocating to bring that policy about. So we're now one of 4 countries in the world who have a men's health policy: ourselves, Australia, Brazil, and Iran. So they're the 4 countries at the moment who have a men's health policy. And it is interesting, even here at the moment in Ireland, the National Women's Council are striving to get a women's health policy. You know, it seems like we were out on the edge and the precipice in some sense in terms of developing a men's health policy. But it's certainly, we're talking to Orla, really, we're trying to say, well, what did we do and how can we go about developing a women's health policy as well? That's not just based around the medicalized interventions. So that was kind of that was somewhat the origins of the work in terms of where we're at, and very much what we're about is about transforming masculinities. It's about working with men to help them to reflect on the lives that they're living, reflect on their attitudes and their understandings, reflect on the stereotypes and traditional norms that are influencing them, so that they can actually embrace a gender equality agenda and not be fearful of it, knowing that in engaging with and promoting gender equality, it has a significant benefit to them as well as their partners, their children, and the women in their lives. So we come from it, where our underpinnings as an organization would be feminist. So we very much kind of work within that particular frame, and therefore when a lot of our work is around partnership and building relationships with various different allies within the sector. And a lot of that then is, as I said, is that we're not a men's rights organization, we're a men's development organization, and that might be a subtle thing for people to hear and understand, but it's a very, very important thing in terms of where we come from as an organization. And that has then, that work then would have brought us then into this, I suppose, the obligation as men in terms to step up into areas around gender-based violence. So we would run, not also do we kind of advocate in terms of this particular work, but we also deliver a number of programs. We, as an organization, we roll out and manage the Male Advice Line, which is a free phone service for men who are victims of domestic abuse. But we also manage and roll out the national service around our domestic violence intervention program, where we work with perpetrators of domestic violence as well. We've been involved in maybe 160 or 70 men on that program as well. So, and then we have a national counselling service also. So there's, as well as just say that the advocacy work, we also do some very practical work. And when we talk in our organisation, and we hear it a lot about saying, well, men need to be part of the solution in relation to addressing the issue of gender violence. Well, these are very practical examples of what we do in terms of the MEND program into that intervention, the domestic violence intervention program, plus also the Male Advice Line, our counselling service, and then also the likes of the White Ribbon Campaign, which is where we see ourselves as stepping in and stepping up, and they're critical kind of things that we like to do, and it's part of what we try to promote with men and generally. So I hope that's not too long and convoluted in terms of what we're about.
No, it's great. It's great. It's really explains a lot, and I think it, points and answers some of the remarks and questions that came up earlier on. Sean, if I could ask you as well, because there's so much well, actually, I'm going to open up the floor to if anyone has any questions about the work of Men's Development Network. But I would also love you to go in a bit further into information about the White Ribbon campaign. But if there's any comments or questions that you have for Sean at this point about the organisation, I see there in the chat box that Nick and Katie have commented, what a brilliant organisation and amazing work. And I think absolutely I agree with you there. Does anyone have a question for Sean at this point, or would you like to hear about the White Ribbon campaign?
Hi, yeah, I have a question, but I can hold it until the end. It's not an urgent question or anything.
No, go ahead, Anna, please. The floor is open to you.
I'm dying to hear about the White Ribbon campaign as well. So,
okay.
No, I just want to say, Sean, it's really great to hear from you, and I really admire the organisation. I work in mental health, so I know what it's like for the importance of men's development, particularly their kind of emotional development. And I'm particularly kind of moved and heartened by the Turn Off the Red Light campaign, because I just think, we're talking about teaching these issues in school, and the whole concept of consent at any level is just utterly negated if a man can walk down the street around the corner and essentially buy a woman. So I think it's a brilliant campaign to see. My question is basically, how have you found like men responding to the kind of notion of patriarchy, kind of acknowledging their privilege, acknowledging the position in the social hierarchy, and how that positioning kind of equates to an enormous amount of power, and that power in so many realms in the world is being abused through violence, rape, domestic abuse, exclusion, just your outright kind of everyday sexism and misogyny. I often find when I bring it up to male friends, male family members, it comes across as, it's male bashing, it's misandry, it's, just the ramblings of a feminazi, etc. No matter how kind of gently you put it, kind of this idea that patriarchy backfiring on men is not evidence that the patriarchy doesn't exist, but one of the kind of infinite reasons for men to join in the fight of dismantling it and liberating everyone from it, because in terms of men's mental health, emotional development, representation of men in family courts, and the enormous pressures of masculinity, their invisibility in discussing violence in all forms against men, particularly sexual and emotional violence against men. I'm just wondering, how have you kind of seen that discussion develop? How have you seen men's development develop over the last 25 years with those kinds of issues? Sorry, that might be a bit ranty.
Yeah, I'm glad you started with a very easy question, Anna. Listen, there has been, first off, there's been enormous shifts. I think we have to say there's a lot more, like, not to paraphrase Bertie Ahern, there's a lot done and more to do, but like there has been significant shifts. And just to give you an example in terms of even what's happened at the start of the pandemic, around there was quite a lot of airplay, if you want to call it, around men becoming taking more active roles in caring within the home due to the pandemic. Okay, that because they were at home, they began to take on more of those caring roles that would have been left by tradition and by default to the women in the home, wherever it may be. And there was a lot of discussion about how men were, the people were saying that, God, there's going to be a big discussion when this pandemic over about who's really going to go back to work full time here, and who's going to do this and who's going to do that, and how much about men had suddenly realized how much they missed out of that aspect of caring and that role and the importance of caring within it. It has, just to kind of burst the bubble on it. Okay, although there was great conversations about that and a lot of people talking about it, we've now reverted back to a certain degree. We're back to the norm in terms of, or the sense of the norm of where it's at, which is disappointing. But the other thing that was really interesting at the start of the pandemic was what I would call the narrative that the start of the pandemic was really, really important. I was heartened, to have to say, as a man, okay, to listen to a leader of our organization talk about taking care of us. That not to worry, we're going to mind you. And that the core essence of what we're trying to do is to take care of you. So don't worry, this is a difficult time, but we're going to take care of you. Don't worry about money for the moment. So there was a person-centered approach around addressing the issue. And like I thought, and what really happened with that was really interesting, that the community at large came with it. They very much embraced it. They got a hold, they did go into lockdown. They didn't breach the rules. The communities came together and supported each other and created a whole range of various different things. And it showed the huge humanity that is out there. And it's that type of humanity that I feel is really important around addressing this issue of gender equality. Because we ask the question all the time, and Anna mentioned around, you know, the understanding of our privilege. I think that's it. Like, certainly I'm acutely aware of the privilege that I would have. Doesn't mean to say I don't abuse it. I think there are times when I certainly do, and I think every man would take advantage of the situation that it can bring. Okay, but I think there are other aspects of that privilege that they wouldn't even be aware of, and that they're engaged in, and that requires a certain amount of education and a cultural shift within it. But I think that sense of privilege can make it very, very difficult, as you say, to engage men around it. And we ask the question a lot of the times when we sit with men in the room, and I think it's one of my colleagues, Lorcan, always kind of hits them with this particular question at the start, and they say, okay, which parts of the patriarchy doesn't really work for you as a man? Okay, and you know, and because most men, when they think of the word patriarchy, is that this is where we talk about the man bashing syndrome emerges, like, oh, you're picking on men, wherever it may be, you know. But we're always saying, when we're talking about the work, we're coming into the work, and say, well, really, okay, so what part of this masculinity that you traditionally see and perceive is not working for you? And we then find things, we get men telling us these things in the room that say, you know, well, you know, I don't get a chance to, I always feel I have to be in charge, I have to be in control, I have to make sure that this is, I'm on my own, I should be self-reliant, I shouldn't need to ask for help, I shouldn't be weak, I shouldn't be emotional, I shouldn't be a whole range of it. And these things prevent me from being the most authentic self that I am. Now, this is not to put on what I call on far booked or on poor, you know, the poor man mode. This is just more about saying things like, these are issues that when we hold mirrors up to ourselves, we realize what we do, whether consciously or subconsciously, to reinforce those particular norms and stereotypes that hugely impact about how we engage with each other and how we view each other. That's the point of position where we come into the work. And it's about kind of offering those spaces for men so that they can actually then reflect on what's happening for them and change their lives, where they don't see it as a threat, because this is not a threat. When we live within an unequal society, what creates that unequals that creates a whole load of stresses and strains for everybody within that society. And people react to those stresses and strains in very, very different ways. And certainly in terms of those traditional norms that are out there, men, when they find themselves not able to cope, they internalize the work. And this is not being generalist, but I think everybody internalizes things. But when men internalize this stuff, they start to get involved in incredibly risky behaviors in terms of drink and you know, drugs and other types of behaviors, including violence. You know, and it's really like, but I think there is really a significant cultural shift that needs to happen around all of our understandings of violence, okay, and all forms of violence. Like, it's really into 95% of violence that happens in the public realm is man on man, okay? Now, there's an element of acceptability about that. People accept that. Everybody accepts. If you look up, if you hold a mirror up to your face and say, it's men and boys who are out there engaging in violent activity, you know, and we seem to say that that's okay, that's allowable. So I think we have to look at that. But yeah, in the private realm, they say, like, you know, it's only, some statistics would say it's 75% female, and then male percent, 25% male would be the victim oriented. Like, I think there's elements of that where it balances up. But I think there is an acceptance of violence within society. We have this acceptance of it. And I really think that the conversation around domestic violence, or violence and violence generally, needs to start. A national campaign needs to happen whereby conversations around the kitchen table or the fireside or in the school or in the workplace is actually discussed, and we give people the language to discuss violence in this particular way. And I think that like, you know, one part of the work is the work we do around encouraging men to reflect on those attitudes and think about those attitudes, and also to do some preventative work with young people in schools, wherever it may be. That they are critical pieces of work to be done, but it does require, I think it does require a holistic approach around it, and how we actually engage with it. Because like as I said, we're 20 odd years in this work. We do a lot of work with women's organizations. They are our allies. We want to come in and support the work they do. We want to step in and step up, but we also know when we should step back. You know, so there are various different things that we try to do around the work, and it can be a challenge around that, because I certainly know when you go back 40 years, I was at a conference last year where the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre were celebrating 40 years, and they were talking about where they came from and how far they had come in 40 years. Now, 40 years ago in Ireland was a very, very different world, and even accepting the issue around rape within marriage wasn't illegal. It was still considered to happen at that point in time. So we've come a long way in terms of moving various different things. But as I said, there are a lot to go. So, but I can really understand where women will be in a position where they'd be reticent around developing alliances with men to address the issue of violence, when they would perceive and have seen before that the main protagonists of that violence are men. So it's a very difficult arena as a men's organisation to come into. But I think we've been fortunate. The previous CEO, Alan O'Neill, was a real firebrand in relation to it, and worked really, really hard and made it very, very easy for me to step into this role that I have and to continue those relationships where we can sit around those tables and be partners with organisations around the Turn Off the Red Light campaign, or the We Don't Buy a campaign, which we're involved in now. So there's an event on the 3rd of December, if people should tune into it, with Mhná around the We Don't Buy a campaign. So they're very important parts of our work, and they are a manifestation of us taking those responsibilities and leading from the front on it. You know, so.
That's great. I really stood out there when you said stepping in, stepping up, and knowing when to step back. You know, it's such a delicate thing in any sort of human interactions when we're talking about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances when it comes to things like equality or violence. But I think that's step in, step up, step back. It's quite powerful in a statement. Does anybody have anything that they would like to add to the conversation at this point before we ask Sean to talk about the White Ribbon campaign?
Sure.
Yeah, it's interesting about the patriarchy, because I think the patriarchy is systemic. It's not men. We want to associate it over the years with being men, but it's actually just systemic. It's systems that are built up around all of us. For example, the working day. The working day is 9 to 5 because it suits men's cycle, and men's cycle goes from one end of the day to the other end of the day, both physically, hormonally, every single way, whereas a woman's cycle is monthly, or every 28 days or 30 days or whatever. And the working day was set up because mostly men were in the place at the time as a 9 to 5. That's a simple example of it. But the patriarchy has become synonymous with men, and that's not right either. And Sean, you kind of alluded to it there, that you ask the men in your group how they are suffering under the patriarchy, and it is that bit where you can't express emotions, and and maybe there's someone here that knows better than I do, but do emotions build up? And if you can't use the release of crying or whatever, or talking the way women do, does it express itself as violence? And I'm not suggesting men are helpless to violence or powerless to it, but is that what happens on a physiological level? I don't know. I think it's an interesting.
I wouldn't know. I think I take care. Our patron is our president, Michael D. Higgins, and last year at his garden party for organisations working to prevent violence against women, he said something at the start at the gig which I thought was really, really interesting. Where he talked around, he said, "Listen, people aren't born violent. It is learned behavior."
Yeah.
And so when you come from that perspective at it, then you have to say, okay, where are we learning this? What is happening? What's going on within our own houses, our own homes, our own communities, our own societies? What are the values that we place? What are the values that are presented that it reinforce that notions of violence, that this is that it is okay, that is you get what you want around that, so I think it's a really it's a point. I think it's the point of reference where you have to come into this work about saying, if you weren't born violent, what was going on around it? So you have to really go at the work from that perspective. We also did something. There was a piece of work that was done by an organization called Promundo, and they do a lot of work, a lot of research in relation to working with men and boys around addressing and work about ending violence against women. But one of the piece of work that they did, I thought was really interesting, and we did a webinar during the summer on it, calling "Boys Will Be Boys," and it was about saying they were talking about young boys, even if they were born and within a household whereby people were aware of those traditional norms and try to confront them and dismantle them and ensure that the young boys had a very open and progressive kind of environment where they lived, that they were encouraged to verbalize their feelings, to have empathy, to be emotionally intelligent, wherever it may be. And they could have all of that. And then they come to a point around they're 10 and 12, okay, when so therefore they have a very clear, a really kind of well-rounded understanding of what masculinity is, okay? And then around 10 or 12, then they go out and they start to broaden their own networks. And broadening their world, that what would happen would be is that the concept of masculinity would broaden also. But actually what they found was that the concept of masculinity narrowed because of all of the various traditional norms that were at play. And I think that's really, really, it's an interesting kind of thing that happens around those kind of, when we talk about transforming masculinities, how do we go about doing that? And how do we change that world? And how do we kind of create the language of discussion around it without it being seen as a threat or an conversation to be had? Yeah.
And I think it's actually just kind of linking back in with Ciara, if you don't mind me mentioning, one of the key messages that came through, if I'm right, in your documentary was here you had, men and all Irish, but on just different sides, were they Republican or Free Staters, and then committing these atrocities that weren't, you know, that he'd like to talk about a little bit about that it was caught up in that nearly that mob mentality or that wave, that these acts of violence were acceptable because it was for the greater good of the freedom of the republic, you know, becoming a republic. I just unmute you. Oh, just unmute.
Hang on. Hi.
There you go. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I found it really interesting. Just the point that was made just there about you know, violence against women being part of the bigger spectrum of violence in general, and male on male violence. Like, that's incredibly true of the Irish Revolution. You know, there was an awful lot of male on male violence as well. A lot of men were murdered. A lot of men were, you know, beaten up, assaulted, and so yeah, the violence that happens against women within the Irish Revolution happens really in that context of an awful lot of male brutality as well. And okay, so there were an awful lot of Irish soldiers involved in it, but there were also a lot of British soldiers in terms of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries and members of the British Army that came over to Ireland. And a lot of those, including a lot of the Irish soldiers as well, would have been through World War I, which was an incredibly brutalizing conflict. And so an awful lot of them would have actually been suffering from PTSD, and then they were unleashed on the streets in Ireland. So I just found that really interesting. I think that, yeah, I think it's about violence in general in society, really, isn't it? And that violence against women is actually a big part of that, but perhaps you can't really address it unless you address the whole concept of violence, and when violence is okay and when it's really not, you know. So I just found that really interesting. It just kind of sparked something in my brain listening to you, Sean. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Okay, so does anyone have any other points? I am really keen for Sean to talk to us about, because I know today you've launched the What's White Ribbon Day, or the White Ribbon campaign. So for those who aren't aware of it, could you just give us a brief overview and how people can get involved?
Yeah. Okay, first off, I suppose, just to give you the origins of White Ribbon, and it is an international kind of campaign that originated in Canada. As a result, it initially started up by a man called Michael Kaufman, who's very much involved in the whole area of transforming masculinities and looking at about the whole area about addressing violence against women. But what actually happened was an incredible traumatic experience in Canada, where some place in Ontario, a young man gathered a whole load of women into a gym. I think it was somewhere around maybe 30 women or something in that region. The number, I can't remember the exact number, so apologies on that end. And shot them all. It caused, as you can imagine, significant, huge revulsion around the world in relation to it. And Michael then initiated this particular campaign, which was the White Ribbon campaign. And they identified the day, I suppose, the 25th of November. And in some countries around the world, they have different days, but certainly around Europe, it was identified, and Canada around the time, of course, that the day to eliminate violence against women as the original day. So it was a pretty traumatic event that brought about the whole issue around violence against women. But it was, what was really important around it at the time was that it was a specific action around men trying to end violence against women, to taking a proactive, positive step to address this particular issue. Okay, so it then took on a range of various different forms, and Michael Kaufman, in his inimitable way, allowed it for agencies and organizations and countries to adapt the White Ribbon campaign to how they felt the best way in which to do it. In Ireland, we went about it in a number of ways. which is based around, there was an education element attached to it, there was an awareness raising aspect attached to it, and there was an advocacy aspect attached to it. We were extremely fortunate at the time when we started to run the White Ribbon program. Tom Meyer came on board as our ambassador, as I said earlier on, and generated a significant kind of awareness in relation to the program because of its particular profile, and it was significant in that end. So the work, as I said, the work is, as I say, very much around the schools work we do. We have a pack of what we call nearly 19 different workshops that we actually bring into schools and work with schools. We try to use a cascade training model with teachers. It's very, very difficult, as you know, trying to work within the school environment or in the school arena. There's huge demands on teachers. There's huge demands on schools. You would think going in with a program that was around addressing the issue of healthy relationships and consent and masculinity and stuff like that they'd be embracing you and kissing you and saying, "Oh, thank God you've come in. Where have you been all our lives?" But that doesn't happen. But I think it's a piece of work there. And of course, there are a plethora of programs and really good programs being rolled out in various different ways. So, but I think there's a piece of work, and this is the work that we're really looking at now, is around ensuring that the curriculum has in it, built into it, something beyond the 3 R's, you know, that there is a more comprehensive and holistic approach towards healthy relationships, consent and sexual relationships, and sex and violence, whatever it may be, as well as including things like the environment, and because these are all the secondary things beyond the 3 R's that go into schools. So it's very difficult to find a space around that, but also that the program starts at 4-year-olds and goes and is age appropriate right through to university level. Okay, and I think that's really, really important, that we actually develop a graduated program whereby it is age appropriate as we go along. Okay, so that when we're engaged, like, there's no point. And I have to say, the schools are like shooting fish in a barrel. It's great to some degree, but that should be, like, I think it's very interesting what's happened around the environment stuff in terms of what's happening, kids coming home from school and then imparting the knowledge to their parents around, we need to be separating our waste in this way, we need to be doing this, we need to be doing that, whatever it may be. And I think that's what needs to happen. But it needs to come the other way as well, because the conversations do need to happen around the kitchen table and do need to happen around the fireside, where people are talking about these things. So it is about, you know, talking to 4-year-olds about, well, what's important to you for a relationship? What do you understand the relationship to be? What is it? What's it mean to be a best friend? You know, all of those type of conversations, and to give them that emotional language which to do that. I think there's a program I was involved in many years ago. It's based around the whole thing of restorative practice, and they have restorative schools, and what they really try to do is give young people and give children an emotional language in which to discuss what's actually happening in their lives, so that it doesn't internalize itself and result in violence or kind of manic kind of, that they actually have the language in which to express, I'm angry and I'm upset and what you did there hurt my feelings, or whatever it may be. And I think having that kind of approach with it and build that emotionality and build that emotional empathy and understanding and a language in which to express that will be vitally important through those early school years. And then you bring it on, and then you bring it into that more age appropriate around, in terms of sexual relations and all those various things, sexual identity, you know, they all form, I think, a continuum, but it needs to be designed and delivered in a holistic way. So that's the work that we do at the moment. The advocacy work is very much around trying to promote that, and we've been working with various different agencies who've been involved in the delivery of other types of program, like the Manuela Riedo Foundation and stuff like that as well, who do that work. So that's that. Then the other work then, I suppose, is the awareness raising, which is very much around kind of We've had campaigns where we've been very fortunate where the trade unions have come involved in the programme, the GAA, the FAI and the IRFU, where we kind of look for champions and male champions to come forward and promote the campaign and show the way and step up and say, listen, this is not acceptable behaviour. And as men who acknowledge that, want to say that we want to change that behaviour and it's not okay. So we've been very fortunate with the likes of Christy Moore and various different, Mick McCarthy last year and a few other, Paul O'Connell and stuff like that. So they've come forward and stepped up into the programme and been ambassadors for it. And then the further bit then really is around, is our work around being involved in things like Turn Off the Red Light campaign and the We Don't Buy campaign, and also around the Sexual Offences Act 2017. We were very much part of a civil society in pushing for that particular change in the Act. So that's that work that we would do there. So it's comprehensive and it's integrated into our day-to-day work. But also we try and kind of push it out there and promote it. And our next steps really we'd like to do next year is to start to look at ways and how we can encourage companies and the corporate world to engage in the whole issue around violence against women and become white ribbon organizations or companies and fulfill. We might have a bronze, silver and gold award for them to kind of attain to by engaging in various different things, including training their staff, making them more aware, putting in place policies in relation to domestic violence, and so lots of various different things around that. So that's the work that's there. So I hope that gives a clear understanding in terms of where we're at. And the campaigns and what we've done have very much been around. Some of it's been around trying to raise a few bob. I would certainly love to have. I have half a dedicated person to work on our white ribbon campaign. So we'd always like to have a full-time person who could be working on the campaign all year round, rather than concentrating around this time of the year. And of course, we also had our International Men's Day campaign. I don't know if people might be involved in that or aware of that. And so that they all come together, and then you have the 16 days of action as well, which is rolling on now. So I think I'm on something like one of these for the next 10 days over the next 16 days. So I think I'm taking action, which is good. Yeah.
Well said. It's just, I think it's really does give a sense of hope. It's great to see it's, action, and it's at grassroots level and it's happening at community level, and it'd be great. And I'm going to share with everybody in a follow-up email, the hashtags and the handles that they can follow and get behind it. And I often think that sometimes, I know Anna mentioned earlier on, like, how do you have these conversations? And sometimes it's pointing somebody as well in the right direction, where the conversation is being had by, as you said, a person that they may recognize within the sporting world or whatever. So and also just it was amazing to hear as well, because earlier on we were talking about the issue around how do you start bringing that conversation and education piece with very young children. But it's great to see that that the programs that you're running are starting with children as young as 4, and as you said, it's
I better qualify that. I think that's where we'd like to be.
Oh, sorry. Well, we'll all hope.
I think that's where we would like to be. The aspiration is certainly there around that, because I think that it goes without saying, I just like, there was a school, just to give a tent around, there was a school in Enniscorthy, a primary school that has involved itself in the restorative practice. It's a restorative practice school, and it's just been amazing in terms of the confidence, and it's really noticeable when you go into that school of how those young people engage with adults, engage with each other, their sense of their own identity and self-respect that they have for each other and themselves. It is incredibly obvious, and a lot of that has to do with that particular process around giving them ways in which to deal with things, like, and let's say for that school doesn't have any teachers in the schoolyard at playtime. They have designated, what they call designated wardens that come up from each class, and that they are all trained in restorative work. All those young people, those kids, and that if a kid comes to them from their own class and say, that fella kicked me or that fella this, they actually go and do an impromptu restorative circle there and then with the kids in the class. And the questions, of course, around restorative work is about, well, what happened? What did it make you feel like? How do you feel now? What do you think should happen next? You know, who do you think was hurt by this? You know, so they're very, very straightforward questions, and they're amazing to kind of bring a resolution around that stuff. And you asked that question of the two individuals at the time. So they're really, it's a fantastic, I think, I'm a real advocate in relation to that restorative practice work. But it is a really good, that's a really good template in which you offer that emotional language to discuss those very conflictual topics of conflict, you know, and give people a language in which to express that thing without turning to violence. So I think it's the way to go. We have a lot of work to do yet. I think to get beyond, I hope there's nobody from the Department of Education here, but Androns, you know, to get inside in terms of developing a curricula that is holistic and graduated and comprehensive across the three strands of, well, the four strands, if you go to Montessori, to primary, to secondary and third level.
Absolutely. So I'd like to open up the floor. Has anyone got any questions for Sean, for Ciara, or any comments they'd like to make to the group? Anything anybody would like to share or ask?
Oh, great, I can go now.
You've only got 15 more days. Nick.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that was absolutely brilliant from both of you. Like my eyes are opened, and it was just such a stimulating pair of inputs. Like it's been fantastic. Really enjoyed it, and have really taken a lot from it. So thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Same, I echo Nick's words. It's fantastic as an eye-opener. Sean, the work you're doing is phenomenal. We just need to have 10 more of you in the country, 100 more. And Ciara, what is on the documentary, it's nudged us forward a couple of steps. So thank you so much, and thanks for organising this, Karen. It's fantastic.
Thanks, Nicola. Thanks for sharing. Does anybody else have any questions?
Could I just ask a question?
Of course you can.
Yeah, I see there's a lady here on the call, Linda Hergety, and I have a funny feeling this is a woman that I know from 20 years ago that I worked with, and I'm just wondering if she put up her thumbs to say if it is.
Yeah, it is me.
It is. Hi, Linda, how are you?
When I heard it was going to be you, I had a quick Google to see if it was going to be you, and I saw the photo and I was like, yeah, that's him. How are you, Sean? You're looking good.
I'm good, Linda. How are you? Good to talk to you.
I'm fine.
We'll actually have another call later on, maybe.
It's becoming like the Brady Bunch or something.
Reunited.
Small world.
Yeah. The
Lots
6
of
degrees.
Yeah, no degrees. Lots of congratulations and thank you, Ciara and Sean. Insightful and thought-provoking questions. Just some comments. I have a problem with my mic, but absolutely stimulating conversation, an evening well spent. So lots of really positive reaction, and I think it's a great way. It's a great way, isn't it? A wonderful workshop, really heartening. Thank you, Ciara and Sean, Aaron, for organising. So it's great. You know, this is it is how do we come out of the despair aspect of it into hope, and I think it's a great way to start 16 days of activism by having great conversation, because it is about awareness and then moving forwards. I'd just like to share my screen because just to move back from the current slide. Now, just moving on there, the white ribbon campaign, just so you can see, it's a green background with the white ribbon. So I would check out Men's Development Network, and I will be sharing all of that with you. But just to also let you know that this is the UN, as you know, the UN International Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women, and this is all around gender equality. So I suppose we're talking about the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 5, and the UN are inviting people to 16 days of activism, and it's the hashtag is Orange the World. And what's really great is, I'm going to share this with you, but on the unwomen.org, basically, if you follow this link, there's lots of really easy, accessible infographics and statements like the ones I showed you earlier. I think that really powerful infographic of don't get raped, which changes to don't rape. So they have tens upon tens of these available that you can easily share they've made it really easy to access and share them on your social media platforms. So really, I suppose what we're being asked to do is get involved by learning more about rape culture, listening to survivor stories, and understanding consent. I know today, Claire, from the head of as I mentioned her earlier, from the Students' Unions of Ireland, and she really talked about the importance of that education piece, and how it was students who really pushed for the issue of consent to be brought to the forefront. And then use the color orange and join in the conversation. So at the start, I was saying we'd love you to keep this conversation going on social media. You can check out Development Perspectives and Men's Development Network and again, I'll send you out the links for those. You will find them on all the social media platforms. We'd love you to, and I'm sure Sean would really appreciate tagging if you are going to be joining that conversation, and with the hashtags Orange the World, Generation Equality, and the White Ribbon Day. I beg your pardon, I will correct that. So I'm just going to stop sharing there. It's been, let me just, there's some comments in the chat box. Yeah, Ciara, thank you. Ciara is just saying thanks. Or there's a message from Linda. Thanks, Ciara. I haven't seen your documentaries, but make sure to look at them now. Unfortunately, enjoyed both speakers, very interesting, thank you. And Ciara, can I just say huge thanks to Sean, that was amazing to listen to, hugely eye-opening, thank you so much. And from Sean, delighted to have the opportunity to participate, and thank you all for your attention. So it's been a great evening, and for me, I know I would like to say thank you all for participating. As I said, I'll send you all a follow-up email. I'd really appreciate, there'll be a survey attached, if you could just spend a couple of moments filling that in so that we can continue. And I suppose, as we all agreed on here, awareness and education is such an important part of the action piece for moving forward. And I just wish you all a very active and proactive 16 days of activism until we come to the 10th of December and the UN Day of Human Rights. I'd really like to thank Ciara Hyland for joining us. And again, you know, it's been wonderful to have that conversation. That documentary had such a profound effect on me, and I know anybody who watches it will agree. I can't wait to see your next piece of work. You've definitely got a fan base here. And Sean, really, really appreciate, I know you've got a really busy schedule, but you've really inspired people, and you know, we're definitely going to be supporting. I think you've got a big fan base here now behind you. We're really going to get behind the White Ribbon campaign. So thank you to all of you. I hope you have a peaceful rest of the evening. And yeah, we look forward to, so keep an eye on Development Perspectives, and you can see our upcoming events. Okay, so good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah,
See you.
good night.
Night.
Thanks,
Good to hear. Bye, everybody.
Thanks very much. Good night.
Thank you. I'm glad you got to see each other 20
Yeah.
years later. Sean, thanks so much. I'll be in touch definitely and follow up.
Okay, no, you're more than welcome, and we'll do something.
Yeah, and I'll forward on the recording if also for both you and
That'll be
Ciara.
great, yeah.
Yeah.
And listen, I got a chance to watch the video